Hello everyone, welcome to today's session where we will explore Anita Desai's acclaimed novel In Custody 1984, a poignant, thought-provoking work that delves into the fading glory of Urdu poetry and the quiet struggles of ordinary lives of modern India. This session will take us beyond the surface of the plot, allowing us to reflect on deeper themes like cultural decay, personal disillusionment, and the tension between idealism and practicality. Before we begin, I would like to pose a quick question to get us thinking. Have you ever felt torn between your passion and responsibilities? That's exactly the space our protagonist Devan Sharma finds himself in. A Hindi lecturer who dreams of preserving a legacy of Urdu literature, but is trapped in a world of limitations. By the end of this session, we aim to understand the cultural and historical backdrop of the novel, analyze the complex characters, especially Devan Sharma and the aging poet Noor, reflect on how the novel mirrors the changing face of Indian society. Moving forward, let's address the introduction of our prominent author Anita Desai. She was born on June 24, 1937 in Mussoorie, India. She is a prominent Indian author known for her profound contribution to contemporary literature. She was born into a culturally rich family. Her father was a Bengali businessman and her mother a German immigrant. This multicultural background influenced her literary voice and thematic concerns. Desai's education began at Queen's Mary School in Delhi, followed by bachelor's degree in English literature from Miranda's House, University of Delhi in 1957. Desai's literary career commenced with her debut novel, Cry, the Peacock, which was published in 1963. Which explores psychological complexities within familial relationship. Over the decades, she has produced a diverse body of work that includes very notable novels such as Voices in the City, 1965, Fire on the Mountain, which was published in the year 1977, and in 1982, there comes The Village by the Sea. And undoubtedly our very popular novel In Custody, which came into existence in the year 1984. Her writing often delves into the themes of identity, cultural dislocation, and the struggles of women in changing society. As we proceed, Desai's literary style is characterized by its lyrical prose and psychological depth. She employs rich imagery and symbolism in emotional landscape of her characters. Her narratives reflect the tensions between Indian tradition and modernity, showcasing her keen observation of human nature and societal dynamics. Throughout her career, Desai has received numerous accolades for her work. She was shortlisted for the Booker Prize multiple times and won the Guardian's Children's Fiction Prize for The Village by the Sea. Additionally, she has been honored with the Sahitya Akademi Award and the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. To wrap up, Anita Desai's contribution to literature are significant not only for their artistic merit, but also for their exploration of complex social issues. Her work resonates with readers worldwide, establishing her a leading figure of Indian literature. And now, let's begin the literary journey. In Custody, as you will see, is not just about keeping someone or something safe, but also about what happens when we try to hold on the beauty in a crumbling world. But before that, let's get familiarized with the very popular characters which are involved in this novel In Custody. The following is a comprehensive list of characters in Anita Desai In Custody, each playing a pivotal role. in shaping the novel's exploration of themes such as cultural decline, personal struggles, and the preservation of art. Let's proceed with the characters list. Devan Sharma, protagonist of the novel, a disillusioned Hindi professor from Lalaram Lal College in Mirpur in his 30s. Much of his life disappoints him as he is unhappily married, loves Urdu but has to teach in the Hindi department, and has not achieved the literary fame he had always hoped for. His negative character traits include fussiness, lack of self-confidence mixed with occasional desire to magnify his ego and lie to himself and others about his capabilities, pettiness, tendency and judging others unfairly, and short-sightedness. When he is asked to interview Noor, he believes his fortunes have changed, but the aforementioned shortcomings coupled with bad luck and other obstacles mean that this is a tedious process and ultimate failure. Next in the line we have Noor Shahjahanabadi. Noor is the greatest Urdu poet, famed throughout India. He lives at Chandni Chowk, New Delhi. He is elderly, wears all white and has a long white beard, and his body had the density, the compactness of the stone. He is excessively fond of food and drink, and he also admits his fondness for women, dance and gambling. When Devan meets him, he lives in a busy Delhi neighborhood and surrounds himself with the sycophants and hangers-on. He fights often with his two wives and seems burdened by old age and time. While he still composes the occasional poem, he seems much more consumed with the variations of his messy life. Our subsequent focus is Safia Begum, Noor's first wife. She is old and uneducated, but her status as the first wife gives her power in the household. She hates Imtiaz and ardently believes in Noor's singular genius. It is Safia who helps secure Devan a private space for the recording and encourages him to do the interview despite the difficulties. But she is also savvy enough to demand payment for Noor's time and effort. Building upon this, let us explore the very significant character Imtiaz Begum, Noor's second wife, and a poet in her own right. Though her skill is completely subjective, Devan finds her to be a shrill, domineering woman who is exploiting Noor, and he has no sympathy for her even when she falls ill or speaks frankly of the difficulties of being a woman poet. He does not admit that she is clever, as she seems to know how to whip up her audience and to display her charisma on stage. But he otherwise sneers at her lower class background. She may have been a dancing girl or a prostitute before she met Noor, though she claims that she was not, and that Noor fell in love with her and for her poetic skills. Now comes another character, Ali, Noor's loyal but long-suffering assistant who endures the chaos of his master's household. In the same vein, let us discuss another character, Murad. Murad is Devan's childhood friend. Devan was poor and Murad was a spoiled rich boy. He runs Awaz magazine in Delhi, a publication devoted to the promotion of Urdu language and its literary practitioners. He is bold, insensitive, self-important, short-tempered and imposing. He offers Devan the writing gig, but he often expresses his doubt in Devan's ability to carry it out. In continuation, let us introduce Mr. V.K. Sai, the publisher of Murad's Awaz magazine. Turning our attention to yet another character, Sarla. Sarla is Devan's overburdened and unhappy wife, who was chosen for him by his family members. She was full of her own dreams of what marriage might be like, but life with Devan rapidly quashed them. She is a woman of many disappointments, regrets, and prone to a sullen disposition and passive aggressiveness when it comes to her relationship with her husband. On to the next point, we have Manu. Manu is Devan and Sarla's son. Devan sees him as complaining, demanding child, but this might show Devan's unhappiness more than Manu's behavior. So, this characterization may be taken with a pinch of salt. Now, let us move on to another character, Mrs. Bhalla, a neighbor of Devan's, known for her self-righteousness, stern expression and meddlesome nature, whom Devan finds particularly very irritating. With that said, let us dive into the next character, Siddiqui, the head of the Urdu department at the college where Devan teaches. Siddiqui is a slim, refined bachelor who lives in a family's ancestral home, a sprawling but battered manor. He loves songs, dance, drink and gambling. At one point, Devan marvels that off campus he is a luxury lover. He is initially supportive of Devan's project, but he grows impatient with Devan's problems and failures and tries to detach himself. Next we have Chotu, the boy who works for Siddiqui. According to Siddiqui, he is a great singer, though poor and uneducated. To continue our discussion, we have yet another character known as Mr. Roy. He is an administrator at the college who helps procure funding at Siddique's request for Devan's tape recorder. Jaidev, a colleague of Devan's in the Hindi department. Devan finds him rather intolerable and the two of them disagree on what matters more in academia and the study of languages, the future or the past. Jaidev cares more about the future, wherein Devan cares more about the past. Up next, we have Trivedi, the head of the department of Hindi, whom he is very hostile towards when Devan asks for leave, erupting in fury, threatening Devan's job and throwing an ink pot on him. Mr. Jain, an electronics dealer and a friend of Murad's, he sells Devan the second-hand tape recorder and offers his nephew Chiku and Pintu up as assistants. He is friendly, but Devan doesn't entirely trust him. Progressing further, Chiku is another character, Mr. Jain's nephew and Devan's main assistant on the recording project. Though Mr. Jain boasts of his abilities, he doesn't prove to be a very effective tech assistant, and his fumbles and laziness often cause problems. However, he is also justifiably annoyed with Devan, who keeps him away from his responsibilities much longer than he anticipated, and who has no real authority or experience in running a recording session. We have a character called Pintu, one of Mr. Jain's nephew sent to help Devan with the tapes. He is quiet and sullen. Now, let us take a look at Raj's aunt, a smiling, silent woman who allows Devan to stay with her while he is working in Delhi. He is unsure whether or not recognize him, but continually provides for him in a kind of self-sacrificing fashion. Now, let us turn on to Dhanu, yet another character who is a student of Devan with a talent for mechanics, who assists in assembling the final tape. However, he later becomes aggressive, demanding good grades for his help along with his friends. Now, let us move on to the session where we will discuss the summary of In Custody, Part 1. Chapter 1. As the story unfolds, Devan is on the campus. When his old friend Murad approaches him, he feels slightly uneasy about the man's loud personality and coarse behavior and tells Murad he has one more class, then he can walk with him. Murad booms that he came all the way from Delhi and wants to see Mirpur's best restaurant. Devan insists Murad wait for him in the college canteen and nervously bounds away. He wonders why Murad is here. When he gets before the blackboard, he tries to compose himself as the students file in behind him. As we have discussed earlier, Murad and Devan are childhood friends and they have been together for a long time. Murad, the rich boy, but whereas Devan, the poor widow's son. But he did not like to be surprised during college hours. For a second, he wonders if Murad came to pay him for the book reviews and the poem he had written for Murad's magazine Awaz. But then savagely tells himself not to expect sudden wealth and entry into literary circles. He starts teaching the poetry class, looking off into the distance as he always does. This makes him a very dull instructor. At lunch, Murad frowns at the food in the small restaurant near the bus depot. Devan thinks it might be better this way, as it shows Murad he isn't well off and might prompt him to pay. Murad does comment on how poorly lecturers are paid and how much suffering they do for their art. Devan is cheered by this sympathy and agrees heartily, saying it is what he has to deal with. He feels bold to comment about being paid for writing. But Murad does not seem to be listening anymore. Murad laments the struggles of running a magazine and the decline of Urdu readership. Devan insists the magazine must survive. But Murad's disdain for Hindi unsettles him, as Devan teaches it despite his love for Urdu. Devan expresses his wish to join Murad in preserving Urdu, but explains he cannot leave his job due to family responsibilities. Writing Urdu remains just a hobby for him. Murad, indifferent, dismisses his commitment and abruptly asks him if he can contribute to an upcoming issue. Devan is both confused and excited, beginning to mention his own poems, but Murad interrupts, saying he already has enough. Instead, he brings up the famous Noor, the star of the upcoming issue, and suggests a feature on Noor's final days. Murad insists Devan conduct the interview, recalling Devan's unpublished monograph on Noor. Devan, nearly speechless, asks if Murad will publish his book, but Murad dismisses the idea and refuses. Despite this, Devan accepts, grateful for the opportunity. With that said, let's dive on to the chapter number 2. Devan is on the bus to Delhi out of his hometown of Mirpur, which felt like a prison to him. Outside, everything is covered with dust, sometimes invisible, sometimes a thick cloud. The whole town looks arid and has no history of note. The residents spend most of their lives in the bazaar that join and separate religious shrines. There is a Muslim area and a Hindu area with differences not clear to the eye but known nonetheless. The bustling yet unproductive town felt like a trap, isolating Devan from Delhi's opportunities and his past joys. Devan wears an uncomfortable green nylon shirt from his in-laws, regretting it for this significant meeting with a literary icon. A man on the bus loses interest when Devan says, "He is a teacher, not a poet." Devan feels dejected, doubting Murad's promises and questioning why he couldn't simply be content with teaching and writing his own poetry. After alighting from the bus, a tea shop owner offers Devan tea, but he is disgusted to find a fly in the cup. Murad then appears and Devan suspects he is avoiding showing him the office, questioning its legitimacy. Murad delays their meeting with Noor, claiming ignorance of the poet's location. Devan protests, but Murad mocks him, refusing to assist. Eventually, Murad agrees to write an introduction letter and sends someone to guide Devan. Visiting Murad's modest office, Devan is torn between disappointment and amazement at his existence. Murad introduces Devan to V.K. Sahib, his publisher and the building's owner. Though their relationship seems strained, this further deepens Devan's doubts about Murad's credibility. Murad quickly writes a note for Noor and hands it to a boy before Devan departs. Unpacking the next layer, let's discuss the summary of chapter 3. The neighborhood is maze, hot and overcrowded. Devan doubts a poet like Noor could live there. Irritated by the boy guiding him, Devan eventually arrives at a house greeted by Noor's booming voice. Entering, Devan feels elated, as though summoned into a realm of poetry and beauty. In the semi-dark room, he sees Noor, an aged figure in white radiating dignity. Devan reads Murad's letter aloud, and Noor mockingly calls him slave to Hindi, when Devan reveals he doesn't teach Urdu. Devan defends his love for Urdu, explaining his practical circumstances. Noor, unimpressed, dismisses him. Devan recites one of Noor's poems, and Noor joins in, appreciating Devan's pronunciation. The moment feels intimate, but the tranquility is interrupted by a chaotic influx of visitors. These include gambling debtors and loud, crude men. Devan is dismayed at their audacity and wonders how Noor endured such company. As the evening progresses, Noor eats and drinks with little dignity, surrounded by sycophantic men. Devan struggles to reconcile this image with his idealized vision of the poet. Attempting to speak with Noor, Devan is interrupted repeatedly. Noor's message therapist arrives, contributing to the commotion. Time passes and Devan feels engrossed by the noise and crowd. He wonders how Noor can create poetry in such an environment. When Noor drunkenly points to Devan mocking him for teaching Hindi, Devan feels humiliated. The situation deteriorates further when Noor introduces a boy to recite poetry and another man drunkenly starts performing his own verses. Devan follows Noor into a dark courtyard where he finds him collapsed and surrounded by chaos. A woman with a screaming child criticizes Noor and spits at Devan, accusing him of idealizing someone who has fallen so low. Devan, stunned and submissive, tries to help but feels powerless. He uses scraps of paper to clean Noor's vomit, realizing with horror they contain Noor's verses. The woman's anger grows and Devan finally flees, ashamed of abandoning the poet in his misery and vandalizing his precious work. Later, Devan reflects on his experience, haunted by his failure to rise to the moment. Taking the next step, let's analyze the historical context and thematic analysis. Devan, the protagonist, is an insecure, dissatisfied man yearning to escape his mundane life and immerse himself in the world of Urdu literature. However, his first meeting with the celebrated poet Noor challenges his aspirations. Devan struggles to assert authority as a teacher, described as boring and unable to command his class. His dissatisfaction stems from teaching Hindi, a career devoid of joy, while longing to contribute to Urdu scholarship. Unlike his friend Murad, who enjoys financial freedom, Devan is constrained by family obligations. Anita Desai uses vivid imagery to reflect Devan's inner turmoil. The dusty, shapeless town of Mirpur symbolizes his stifling existence and lack of purpose. The town's unproductive bustles mirrors his futile attempts to find fulfillment. Devan's excitement at meeting Noor is immense. Climbing the stairs to Noor's home feels like shedding his burdens and steps into a new enlightened world. However, the laborious journey predicts the chaos and disillusionment awaiting him. This encounter exposes the harsh realities behind Devan's idealized dreams, setting the stage for a distressing narrative of unfulfilled aspirations. So, students, let's come to a conclusion. So, I would like to say that in essence, In Custody begins by highlighting Devan's journey and encounter with Noor, dwelling into themes of cultural decline, unfulfilled ambitions and existential struggles. Desai masterfully portrays the complexities of preserving artistic heritage in a changed society while examining the fragile aspirations that define the human experience. With this, I end my lecture. Thank you all for joining today's session. Your time and participation are truly appreciated, and I hope you found the discussion very valuable. Your engagement makes these sessions meaningful, and I look forward to your continued interest in the future events. Thank you all.